It was a hot, humid New Orleans afternoon that August day in 1953 as Bubba Patterson drove through the busy downtown streets on his way to the once elegant Garden District. Faded mansions set back from the streets, many dating back to the 1850s, some enclosed by high walls. The culprit mansion was one of those. Driving through the iron gate that was open for him, he parked on the cobblestone courtyard near the carriage house, and far away from the mighty oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. He hurriedly put up the top to his convertible, then rushed down the walk. These grounds were being tended by an elderly black man, his age apparent in his bent posture, his white hair clipped short under his big slouch hat. As Bubba made his way up the brick walk that was mostly taken over with grass, he noticed that the fountain had gone dry, with nothing but a dead leaves filling its once ample spaces as ivy poured from the mouth of a dolphin. Walking up the front steps with two rustic stone lions guarding, he knocked on the door. Letting go of the doorknob as he stepped back to survey the facade of this once stately house, tall, fluted columns running up at least 40 feet to the roof, topped with Corinthian finials, some of which were broken and begging for repair. Birds nested here and there, filling the holes. The front gallery was long, with a floor of brick in a basket weave pattern, was barren of any furniture at all. Left two large marble urns flanked the sides of the door and looked as if they should be filled with potted plants, maybe ferns, but they were empty and filled with only dust and cobwebs. Suddenly the huge door opened, and there stood a stout, gray-haired black woman of about 60, wearing a neatly pressed black dress and crisp white apron. Noticing that though the outside was shabby, the inside was sparkling clean, no doubt due to the efforts of this woman who stood before him, he was instructed to have a seat on the settle in the wide hall while she announced him to her mistress. Presently the maid motioned to enter the room she said was the drawing room. On entering the high-ceilinged room, he saw a massive wing-back chair next to a crackling fire, with a small, withered woman in an old-fashioned dress of black lace. High collar covering her slim neck. Her white hair was pulled back from her face and covered by a matching lace cap. Her face was wrinkled, but the wrinkles had set in an interesting pattern and had been powdered over. Her hands covered with black gloves up to her long sleeves of her dress. Over all, she wore a type of woolen cape pulled around her and fastened with a small gold filigree pin in the shape of a butterfly. Her lap covered with a brightly colored crocheted afghan. The room was large but stifling hot. Because of her age, the elderly woman seemed not to be able to get warm. As Bubba approached her, she looked up with a start. A crooked smile came across her face. Obviously, she had been drowsing in front of the warm fire until she felt his footsteps. It was hard for him to imagine that this woman before him was the oldest living woman in the world. She was 111 years old. "You're late," she snapped, as her face broke into a bigger, more definite smile. He quickly replied, rather loudly, "Yes'm, got caught in the traffic." He didn't think a little white lie would hurt. Then she said, "I'm old, not dead, and my hearing is as fine as it ever was." Laughing, he knew instantly he liked Miss Starla Colbert and hoped he would do a good job with her story. Looking into Miss Starla Colbert's clear green eyes, he could see the twinkle as she looked back over her memories of her past. He wondered just what was coming to mind that put that look in her eye, that smile on her face. She began speaking slowly but clearly. "I was born in Mississippi, on a plantation south of Natchez, between Natchez and Baton Rouge, on the Mississippi River. My father was a prosperous planter by the name of Jean LeBlanc, a Creole from New Orleans, who raised both cotton and slaves. I was told I was born during the spring planting season of 1842. I loved my father, and he loved his children. He was a good, loving man, and I still miss him. He called me his shining star." Miss Starla Colbert looked like she was in deep thought, as if something was troubling her. "In those days," she said, "the South depended on both cotton and slaves to survive, and my father had plenty of both. All the children on the plantation, both black and white, grew up in the fields, running up and down the long rows as workers' bent bodies toiled. When we got in the field hands' way, they would pop our bottoms if the overseers weren't looking. Growing up on the banks of the Mississippi River, we learned to swim and fish as soon as we learned to walk. When we were very young, we had no idea the differences in race. We all played together. But the older we got, we were taught by the elders that the color of one's skin not only made the difference between master and slave, but also within the slave community, depending on the hue of your skin. We were told that the boogeyman or devil was black, and that if we were bad, he would come to get us and take us away. So when we saw one of the darker slaves, who was very black, we would run squealing, calling them the boogeyman, knowing full well that we had been bad and done something that would have been considered an infraction and warrant our being taken away by the feared boogeyman. Light shone through cracks in the rough-hewn cabin door as the master of Riverview Plantation pushed his way inside. Light in the cabin, dim as it was, casting dancing shadows on the freshly whitewashed walls. The scent of smoky, burning whale oil mingled with sweat from their hours of trying to bring a baby in the close confines of the small cabin. A woman lay on a low bed made of quilts and straw over tight ropes of a wooden frame cot. Pale, with sweat coming in rivulets, as her low moaning gave way to shrieks of agony. In the distance, the low, steady beat of drums kept rhythm with the tension in the room, getting louder and more intense with each passing second. The cold black midwife crouched down between the woman's legs, trying to assist her in the birth that was slowly and painfully taking place. The baby's father stood to the side with his hands on the mother's shoulder. He was at a loss for what to do. "Can't you give her something for the pain?" he asked. "I has already gave her all the laetrum I can, Master Sir." The crone of a woman placed a piece of old shoe leather in her patient's mouth to bite on. Coming behind her, the master of Riverview cradled Monique in his arms, instructing her to push. As he leaned forward, he felt something under her pillow, and on pulling it out, he could see that it was a butcher knife, covered in blood and chicken feathers. "What's the meaning of this? You know how I feel about hoodoo on this place." "The root worker, Mammon Chloe, said it would help cut the pain, so I let her put it under the pillow," Franny said. Then after one final push, the midwife looked up into her master's eyes and said, "Is a coming." So after hours of suffering, the child was born, lily white, with beautiful blue-green eyes, the hair the color of wheat already in curls. Never had Franny the midwife seen a baby come with so much hair already on its head. Once she spanked its bottom and its lungs filled with air for the first time, it let out a healthy cry. The father took one look and said, "She's beautiful." The woman looked up to him to hand him the child she had bundled up. "This here a buck, not a wench." The loving father held his son in his arms and marveled at his beauty. Such rosy cheeks, he thought, as he held him down to his mother to see. Tears came into her eyes because no matter how beautiful he was, and no matter how white his skin, he was born into slavery, just as much a piece of property as the blackest slave on the plantation. Sylvester was born that day in 1842 to John LeBlanc and his octoroon slave. John hated to leave Monique alone, but she had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep shortly after seeing their son. So being hot and sweaty, he thought it was a good time to go out to the well house for a cool glass of whiskey. As he passed the mighty oak just outside the birthing house, he took no notice of the crouching form hidden in the shadows of the low-hanging Spanish moss. Slinking out into the light of the moon, the form of a white woman, heavy with child, came into view. She slowly approached the door to the cabin. Taking the latch in hand, she opened it quietly. Granny looked up from her work to notice her mistress standing before her. The midwife bowed her head to acknowledge Angelique LeBlanc in reverence of her mistress, but both kept silent. She walked over to the bed where the woman lay with her newborn babe. She could see how beautiful and white the baby was, and could quickly see that her own husband was the father. The longer she stood looking down at Sylvester, her eyes filled with tears that fell freely to the cabin floor. Now she knew for sure that Monique and her husband were lovers. just how she was going to handle this revelation was impossible at this time to tell. But for sure her heart was broken, as she herself was in love with John LeBlanc and had tried with all her power to make him a good wife in every way she knew how. But this white devil laying before her had bewitched her husband, taken away his love and captured his very soul. How could she rid herself of her tormentor? She had no idea, but she knew she must to keep her husband and her sanity. Just as Angelique was turning to leave, she was overwhelmed with pain, clutching her stomach and screaming as she went to her knees. Granny called for help and could see there was no time to move her to the big house because the water had already broken and the baby was coming. So she had her placed on the cot next to Monique. She quickly gave her as much Laetrum as she dared, then delivered her baby that was quick in coming. When John came back to the cabin to check on Monique and the baby, he was shocked to see both his mistress and his wife laying side by side, both sleeping with bundles beside them. Looking at the baby, he was amazed at how both looked exactly alike. Sylvester and his sister Starla could have been twins. Riverview Plantation spread 3,000 acres on the eastern banks of the mighty Mississippi, near the settlement known as Fort Adams, with Natchez to the north and Baton Rouge to the south. Seasonal flooding of the river provided its white inhabitants rich fertile soil, producing a multitude of crops: cotton, sugar, indigo, and a human crop in the form of slaves. The big house, a large affair, made of white stuccoed brick with white columns running the full length to the roof of the gallery, where a large second-floor gallery overlooked the river, and was the perfect place to catch a late afternoon breeze. Formal gardens filled with crepe myrtles, mountain laurels, and roses offered charming promenade down river rock paths outlined in monkey grass. Behind the main house was a complex of outbuildings that formed a self-containing community, each connected to the next by a gravel path, starting with the two-story wooden kitchen house where all of the cooking and preserving were done, as well as where the kitchen servants slept at night. The kitchen was close enough for meals to be brought into the back door and into the dining room of the main house, and at the same time keeping the smells of cooking and preserving from filling the main house. The well house was directly behind the kitchen, where items such as milk, eggs, cheese, and butter were lowered into the cold water to keep them fresh, as well as jugs of sweet chilled tea and lemonade when lemons were in season. The kitchen garden was close behind the kitchen, where a crew was kept busy weeding and gathering crops during the full growing season. Then there were smaller cabins with special uses, such as the smokehouse for smoking and drying meats, then a group of small buildings known as the factory. This group consisted of the spinning house for spinning of wools and cotton into yarn, the loom house for weaving of homespun fabric that was used to make the field hands clothing, then the sewing house where the fabrics were made into clothing. Across from the factory complex was the storehouse, where supplies were stored for the plantation and given out as needed by the mistress of the plantation. Next to the storehouse was the dairy, where raw milk was made into other useful products for plantation life, such as butter, cream, clabber, buttermilk, and cottage cheese. Now behind the dairy was the wash house, where all the laundry was done for the big house and the kitchen. Farther away from the house was the livery stable and the blacksmith shop, leather shops where all the harness and shoes were made, hen houses, pig pens, milk barns, then the slave quarters where the slaves lived. The original mistress insisted that they be built at a distance where they could not smell any offensive odors that might float up to the big house. 30-year-old John LeBlanc, fourth-generation master of Riverview Plantation, and a Creole whose French family were one of the founding families of New Orleans, was tall, fair, with bright blue eyes and wavy blonde hair, the color of wheat. John had spent all of his life learning his job of master. However, Angelique, his wife, came into her position ill-equipped of the knowledge of running a large plantation. Angelique, growing to young adulthood in the safe cocoon of her family home in New Orleans, where learning the art of the piano, needlepoint, and lace-making were the major subjects of her study. She had spent 3 years in the Burlington Academy, where she learned to read, cipher numbers, and use her brain to figure out how to keep her dance card filled and snare just the right bow that would make her a fine husband. She had met Handsome John during the Christmas ball of 1836. He was a tall, handsome, and gallant young man of a fine Creole family, of whom had been a part of Louisiana society long before her own family had arrived. After a short courtship, they were married in an elaborate ceremony in the Catholic Church, with a reception at her family home afterward. Then all too soon she made her way to his family plantation upriver in the Mississippi Delta. On the plantation, she learned quickly that she was in charge of not only the house, but the kitchen, the gardens, the dairy, the factory, the storehouse, the wash house, the smokehouse, the hospital, and the chapel. When she arrived, John's mother, Marcia, was there to welcome her and show her firsthand what she would be responsible for during her days as mistress. After a mere 6 weeks training time for Angelique, Marcia made her departure for Le Petit Chateau, a cottage some distance away from the main plantation complex, which had been the original plantation house, then later the residence of John's grandmother when she retired there. It was a LeBlanc family tradition that gave the new mistress a chance to take charge of her duties of the plantation, and at the same time giving the much overworked ex-mistress rest, relaxation, and a time to dabble in her own trifles at long last. Marcia took with her her personal servants, a cook, a housekeeper, and her longtime personal maid, Matilda, who had been a wedding gift and was now more of a companion and friend than a slave. Marcia's husband died from a stroke after lingering for several years in a much incapacitating and humiliating state of torment to himself and those around him. He was now buried in the family cemetery on the plantation near Le Petit Chateau. so she could spend many hours visiting with him under the shade tree while engaging in needlepoint, which was a favorite pastime. John had taken over for his father and had done very well, clearing more lands and fields than ever before and bringing in heavy cash crops. Now it was his turn to build a life here on Riverview Plantation. Angelique soon found that she was trapped in a life not of her choosing, where she had no control. She was just as much a slave to her husband as the blackest slave in the plantation, a place where white men ruled and cotton was king. Monique, a Creole of color from New Orleans, was of French and Spanish descent, with just enough Negro tossed in to spice up the mixture, making her exotically beautiful in the slave. Monique had become John's placee in 1832 at the age of 16 and moved into the plantation to assist his mother with her sewing needs. Monique was a trained seamstress, and prior to giving birth, she had slept in a small room in the main kitchen house. Sylvester and his mother lived in a small cabin behind the kitchen house, a cabin that had been used as a drying kitchen for herbs and flowers. It was whitewashed and meagerly furnished with a small bed, table, and chairs, and it made their home complete. His early memories were of playing idly in the yard with the other slave children. All slave children, both male and female, wore a sack-like dress until they were put to work around the plantation. Monique made sure that Sylvester's dress was well made with ruffles and fancy stitches. Sylvester's hair grew long and beautiful, and his blue eyes turned a vivid green that showed with a tint of yellow in the sunlight. He was such a beautiful child and was mistaken by all newcomers to the plantation as a girl instead of a boy. As the master's other children came to the age they could venture into the quarters on their own, they quickly found Sylvester, and they all soon became playmates. They too thought he was a girl and treated him as such, and grew up to not really know the difference between boys and girls. The first few years of Sylvester's life were spent close to his mother in her tiny space she used as her sewing room, playing with the scraps of cloth covering the floor as his mother worked. He learned early how to use a needle and began sewing little misshapen cloth dolls out of the fabric scraps to play with. He even made some for his little half-white sisters that came to visit him. There was Starla, who was the same age as Sylvester, then Gabrielle, who was about 2 years younger. Then there was the boy, Charles, who was older than Sylvester. Some days he would be allowed to visit the children in the big house and play with them in their playroom. There was a horse covered in real horsehair that rocked back and forth, which Charles dominated when he was playing with them. There were wooden toys, brightly painted with wheels to pull around the room, making clicking, clacking noises as they went, and dolls of all sizes, making his little cloth dolls look like the rags from which they were made, dolls of china, porcelain, and some of wax. Sylvester loved to sit and look at them, scared to even touch one lest he might break it. but he wanted so badly to just hold it in his arms and cradle it. One day, Starla gave Sylvester a tiny doll made of china. It was her favorite because it was so small and she could carry it with her in her pocket. But she wanted Sylvester to have it to play with when he was not with the other children. To Sylvester, this was a treasure, and he treated it with utmost care. When he returned to his small cabin, he took his baby and rocked it back and forth, then put it to sleep under their bed, where he kept it hidden when he was not playing with it, naming it Starla after his dear sister Starla, who had given him the doll in the first place. Sylvester and the girls would sit at the tiny table in their playroom, having pretend parties with small china as Charles played busy with his pretend battles fought with real-looking toy guns. When time came for the children to be educated, they started making the long walk each morning to their grandmother's house. She taught them the ABCs, how to read out of a few old school primers she had kept from her own childhood, and basic arithmetic, how to add and subtract, even some division. It was French that she enjoyed teaching the children the most because she missed hearing it spoken, because English had been the main language of Riverview. When they went to grandmother's, there was neither black nor white, just Grandma's babies. On one such occasion, the children met an old crone of a woman who was visiting their grandmother. This woman looked like a wild woman to the children. She had feathers in her matted gray hair and bones tied together forming a necklace that hung around her neck. She was giving their grandmother a small bag that was tied with strings, then waving her hands over it and saying some words they didn't understand. She made her way past them and out the front door. "Who that?" asked Charles. "That's Mammon Chloe, the root worker," their grandmother said. "She works magic." The children stood with their mouths open. "She can heal the sick. I've been feeling poorly lately, and she made me a potion that will help ease my aches and pains." The children had never seen her before, and they wondered where she lived. "She living out in the woods behind here in an old cabin that used to be part of the old slave quarters when the plantation was first built. Now the woods have taken that most of the land back over to the forces of nature. She'd been out there since before I came to the plantation about 30 years ago. I heard she was brought here by your papa's grandfather, all the way from Haiti, an island out in the ocean. That's where she brought her voodoo from. He always let her be. She don't harm anybody. Seems to be something our workers need to have their own religion, and she helps them all out with doctrine and such. Your daddy don't much like having her around, but he believed enough in her power not to harm her or get in her way." The children were sitting on the floor around their grandmother as she told the story of Chloe. They were enchanted in this magical woman. She reminded them of some of their witches they had read about in their fairy tale books. "Would she turn us into frogs if we go out to her cabin, Grandmother?" asked Starla. "Well, I ain't never heard of nobody on this place being turned into no frog, but you children better not be traipsing out in them woods, getting in her way. No telling what she would do if you rile her up." The children promised their grandmother they would not go out into the woods looking for Chloe, but deep inside they wanted nothing more than to venture out into the unknown and learn more about this. While John had been away on business in Natchez, the mistress of the plantation stayed busy in her never-ending responsibilities of keeping the plantation running smoothly. It was early spring, and the factory was busy making cotton clothing for the field hands to wear during the hot summer. Every able-bodied female whose fingers were nimble enough to push a needle and thread through the coarsely woven fabric was put to work sewing clothing. Monique was in charge of cutting out the fabric from the patterns she kept neatly stored in the sewing house, then showing the workers just how they were to be stitched together. 2 days after John's trip upriver, Angelique made her inspection of the factory to see how production was going when she saw Monique walking about the plantation from the loom house to the sewing house with her long, wavy hair flowing down instead of being tied up in a bandana, as was the rule of the plantation. Her venom for Monique was strong. How arrogant, she thought Monique, to show off in front of the whole plantation and parade about like she was the mistress. She ordered that Monique be taken to the whipping post and stripped. All the whole plantation was summoned to witness the punishment. Then taking the shears that Monique had used to cut the cloth, the mistress cut Monique's hair and cut it to the scalp, cutting her with savage roughness. Satisfied she had done her Christian duty to battle sin, she then had her flogged. When John returned, he found the whole plantation strangely quiet. None of the usual beehive of activity except for the normal work duties, no laughing or singing. Even the slave children were absent when he arrived. Walking into the plantation sewing house, he found Monique in her little sewing room, working her fingers without even looking up at him. He came behind her and put his arms around her to embrace her. She pulled away, and her scarf came off her head, exposing her shame. "What in the name of God happened to you?" John asked. "I sinned and had to be punished," said Monique, without even looking up from her sewing, with tears filling her eyes. Again he tried to embrace her, and again she pulled away, saying, "I don't worry for myself, but she done took Sylvester into the big house, and I fear what she might do to him. I will lay down the law to her not to ever touch him. But you, my love, must get away from here before she has a chance to do this or something worse to you." That night when John went into the big house, he took his wife by the arm and led her to the study where he drew the door closed with a loud crash. He swung around and slapped her across the face with enough force to send her crashing to the floor, her ring of keys clanging like a dinner bell. "How dare you strike me like a common field hand," she said, staring up at him with contempt. Pulling herself up from the floor, she straightened herself, then faced her husband's anger. "So you heard about the little party we had while you were gone? That wench has to learn her place. I'm the mistress of this here plantation, and my children are the heirs, and not her little white nigger bastard." John came toward her with his hand outstretched to strike her again, then stopped and looked down at her, then coldly with a tone she had never heard before, and sent chills down her back. John said, "I promise you that if you ever lay another hand on Monique, or even think of hurting Sylvester, I will kill you. And that I promise you." On that note, John turned on his heels and out of the house he went, slamming the door behind him. John spent as much time as he could with Monique, in their little cabin, making love and planning their departure from Riverview. Sylvester was 5 years old when he was moved into the big house and his mother was taken away from the plantation. Sylvester was dressed in his brother's hand-me-downs that were too small for him. Then he was instructed he was to be the playmate for all of the children. Being only 5, he wasn't able for much responsibility, but he learned quickly and soon was responsible for keeping their playroom in order and the children's clothing kept tidy. But mostly he had fun playing games with the children. He missed his mother terribly at first and cried himself to sleep many nights. He slept on a tumble bed that slid out from under his brother's bed, but on many nights Starla would take him in her bed to comfort him when he was crying. "You don't need to cry, Sylvester. Star, I love you." She would wrap her arms around him as he buried his head in her long blonde hair, crying himself to sleep. Starla and Sylvester became so close during their early childhood, they forgot they were young mistress and slave. The girls enjoyed dressing Sylvester up in their old clothes, much like dressing a life-size doll. And Sylvester loved these times so much he wanted to dress that way all the time. It was amazing how much Sylvester looked like Starla when he was dressed up in her clothing. The same delicate features, even the same color of hair and eyes. The only difference was that Sylvester was slightly taller, but not enough to notice unless they were standing side by side. The children loved to play tricks on people when they came to visit the plantation by pretending that Sylvester was Starla, dressing him up and sending him in her place. Sylvester loved this charade, but of course it was embarrassing when Starla popped up from behind a chair or a bush to say they were all tricked by Sylvester, the Negro playboy. One day it was arranged for a photographer to come and take photographs of the children, and the children decided to play their little game on everybody again. It wasn't until they had finished taking the photographs that Starla ran in full of laughs at how they had all been tricked. This time their mother had had all she could stand, so she punished all the children. She then turned to Sylvester and slapped him across the face. "Do you want me to cut all that pretty hair from your head like I did that whore of a mother of yours?" she shouted. Sylvester was never to wear anything again but boys' clothing, or he would be severely punished. Sylvester burst into tears as his father came in to comfort him. Then turning to his wife, he said, "What did I tell you long ago? If I hear or see you ever touching Sylvester again, I will do for you what I promised then." She stood her ground with her arms folded, then marching up to her, he pulled her by the hair, then up the stairs into their room where he slammed the door behind them. Shouts and screams came from the room, then all was silent. Coming back down the stairs, John found Sylvester cowering behind a chair. Taking him in his arms, he held him close and said, "She won't ever touch you again. You can wear whatever you want of the children's old clothes. Just don't try to pretend to be Starla. It's just not right to trick people." Sylvester was moved to La Petite Mansion to live with his grandmother. Sylvester became more secure living with grandmother and not having to take the verbal and physical abuse from Angelique.